Good morning, everyone. I hope that you are staying safe on this cold and wintry morning as I look out my window and see the snow and ice and just kind of general prettiness, but at the same time, kind of nasty too. Anyway, I hope everyone is doing okay in these conditions and certainly thoughts and prayers go to everybody. Sorry we can't be together this morning in church, but hopefully we'll be able to be back together real soon. I We just finished up the Christmas season, and one of my favorite things to do during the Christmas season is to watch a Charlie Brown Christmas. My favorite moment is that moment that really is the climax of the story when Charlie Brown cries out, "Can anyone tell me what Christmas is really all about?" Charlie's friend Linus then steps to the center of the school auditorium stage and he recites the story in the Gospel of Luke of the angels who announced to the shepherds that the Savior of the world had been born. Linus then turns to Charlie and says these now famous words. "That's what Christmas is all about, Charlie Brown." This year, as I watched that scene again, I felt challenged to expand Charlie Brown's question even a little farther. Let's not just ask what Christmas is really all about. Let's ask what Christianity is really all about. Christianity's been around for 2,000 years, and in that time, there's a lot that has come to be associated with Christian faith that Jesus' disciples would probably not recognize. Denominations, churches on every corner, creedal statements, large mission organizations, books upon books of theology and Christian living. It's not to say that these things are bad, but they sometimes make it harder to find the truly essential gospel message that gave birth to Christianity so many years ago. And so, over the next few months, I want to invite us to come to our faith with this simple question: what is it really all about? In several series of sermons, I hope to declutter our faith a little bit, with the goal of making a very plain understanding of Christian faith that we can better lay claim to for ourselves and share with our world. In short, I hope to answer the question, what is faith all about? C.S. Lewis was once tasked with answering this question. Perhaps most well known as the author of the Chronicles of Narnia books, Lewis was a professor of English literature at Oxford and Cambridge in the mid-20th century. He fought in the trenches of Europe in World War I, where he was wounded in battle. By the time World War II began in 1940, Lewis was unable to return to battle as a soldier, so he enlisted as an air raid warden when the bombings of Britain that we know as the Blitzkrieg began. In this capacity, he was given the opportunity to talk to the pilots of the Royal Air Force who would be flying battle missions. Most of these men understood that they would not live to see the end of the war. Lewis therefore sought to share the essence of faith in its purest form, for these men could not be bothered with triviality. He talked to them of the problems of suffering and pain and evil. He talked to them of how faith was the strongest response to these problems. As a result of these talks, Lewis was invited by the BBC to give a series of radio broadcasts about Christian faith. These broadcasts would be aired throughout England over the course of 2 years, during the height of World War II. So powerful and comforting were Lewis's words that he was asked to set them down to paper. As a result, Lewis penned the book Mere Christianity, a book that is still considered to this day one of the best explanations and arguments for Christian faith. Over the next few Sundays, I would like to bring the heart of Lewis's words to bear on our lives today, in the hope that we might discover anew the power and comfort of mere Christianity. As we come to our faith with the question of what it is all about, Lewis challenges us with the most basic question. How do we know that faith is really about anything? Why should we believe that there is some greater power out there that, though invisible to our eyes, can be known or even experienced? According to Lewis, the answer to that question comes from an unusual place. It doesn't come from the heavens or in the sweet and tender moments of life. No, Lewis says that the answer to the question of how we know there is something or someone to believe in is found in our arguments. Consider the last disagreement you had with someone. It could have been about anything: politics, money, whose turn it is to feed the dog. More than likely, in the course of that disagreement, you made an argument that appealed to some kind of standard that you expected the other person to know about. We use words like right or fair in our conversation to describe or bring light to that standard that we assume the other person knows. At the same time, the other person disagreed with us, stating that their action or idea really didn't go against that standard of right or fair or just. Or maybe they were arguing that if it did, it was because the case in question allowed for some kind of special excuse. For example, though it was one child's assigned task to feed the dog, that child had not fed the dog because they had walked the dog, which was supposed to be someone else's responsibility, and therefore it was only fair that since they had done the work for someone else should take the responsibility for feeding the dog. The point is, whatever we are arguing or disagreeing about, most of our disagreements hinge on the idea that there is some sense of fairness or decency or rightness that everyone should know and be aware of. Even the fact that we argue at all is evidence that we believe there is some universal standard of right. When you look at the animal world, there is no such thing as an argument. There is just a fight where blood is drawn, wounds are inflicted, sometimes even lives taken. Such behavior in humans makes us all recoil in horror. Why? Because we all know that it is not how we should treat one another. But where does this knowledge come from? What is this understanding of fairness or justice or rightness? What is this? Where does this understanding of how things ought to be begin? Even though we can't always agree on exactly what it means, something within us tells us that it is there. And this knowledge of how things ought to be is accompanied by another awareness. Whatever that law of fairness or rightness is, we don't always keep it ourselves. And when we violate it, it often produces some kind of effect on our lives. Maybe we feel guilty and we seek some way to make the situation right. Or maybe we feel that our action was excused for some reason, maybe by circumstances or by other factors. It's been a bad day, I was tired, etc. Our guilt or our excuse is also evidence of the reality of this universal law of right. If we did not believe in this law, why would we feel guilt? Why would we feel the need to excuse ourselves? We would just do what we do without a second thought. Yet that is not our experience. Even though we do not always do what we believe to be right, we know that there still is a right that we ought to do, and that we all ought to do it. And thus we find ourselves with the conclusion that C.S. Lewis, the former avowed atheist, found himself at. If there is some sense of right and justice which everyone, religious, non-religious, political bent of whatever type or form, upbringing of whatever experience, if there is some sense of right and justice which everyone gives assent to, even if we cannot always agree on the exact details of it, then we are left with the conclusion that this law, which we inherently know to exist, means that there is a universal will for the world to be a certain way. for people to act a certain way. And if there is a will, then there is a mind, a person, in whom that will is located. This, Lewis says, is the first step of faith. Accepting the existence of the person whom we as Christians have named God, whose will we accepted without question before we even knew his name. Every time we talk about what is fair or what is right, we are admitting to our belief, whether we realize it or not, that there is a God who has established a universal fairness, a universal rightness, in which life is best lived. The Apostle Paul wrote to the Romans and said, "For what can be known about God is plain to them, because God has shown it to them. Ever since the creation of the world, his eternal power and divine nature, invisible though they are, have been understood and seen through the things he has made." The first step of faith is not learning a secret or discovering the invisible. Paul and C.S. Lewis both believed that the first step of faith is stating the obvious. We believe there is right and wrong, just and unjust, fair and unfair. We assume that all people should have this understanding, and we believe that this understanding is correct even when others don't always abide by it, and even when we ourselves do not abide by it. There is a law for how things ought to be, even when they are not that way. That understanding is the evidence of God that has been knit into creation, and it has been right in front of our eyes, a part of our language, the assumption of our life all along. This morning, maybe you are not ready to talk about Jesus or salvation. Maybe you are not sure yet about heaven or the afterlife. I'm not going to ask you to jump into the baptismal pool yet if you aren't ready. But what I do want to ask you is this. Are you willing to take the first step of faith and say, "I believe there is a will for the world and life as they are to be. And if there is a will, then that will belongs to someone, and I will call that someone God." Paul said to the Romans that it was the unwillingness of people to confess this obvious point that led to so much of the evil that we see in our world. Because if we run from this most basic idea, then we are running not only away from a belief in God, but we are running away from the right and the just and the good that God has willed. When we take this first step, this step of confessing that yes, there is a God who has willed right and good for the world, we take a step to change the world into the right and the good that we believe should be a part of our life. Are you ready to take that first step today?